You didn't even realize what you did you? The voice was flat, almost emotionless, but there was something in it that made Derek's insides clench. Now ask yourself, how many times have you done this before? Mark pressed Justin against the cold hood of the Lexus, certain that this black guy in an expensive coat was another threat, not a federal agent with access to Washington. Phones were already being picked up, and he had no idea how quickly his life would turn to ashes until. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. Chicago never sleeps, but the streets of the South Side seemed especially restless this late evening. A cold wind blew trash along the sidewalks, the streetlights flickered, as if tired of illuminating the endless stream of human drama. Mark Stevens sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He was 38 years old, 12 of them in uniform, long enough to be accustomed to the smell of asphalt mixed with gunpowder smoke and the constant tension in his chest. His shift was already in its 9th hour, and he was dreaming of hot coffee and a couple of hours of quiet at home. But here, in this neighborhood, you can't relax. That's what they told him since day one. Keep your eyes open, Mark. Every other person here is hiding something. He noticed him by chance, a black man in a dark coat, getting out of a shiny black Lexus in front of the Riverside Plaza Hotel. The model car cost more than Mark had earned in 2 years, and this neighborhood was not a place for such toys. The man moved confidently, with a slight tiredness in his gait, as if he had just finished a long day. In his hands was a leather briefcase, and on his wrist there was a flash of an expensive watch. Mark squinted. Something didn't add up. The Lexus, the hotel, this neighborhood, too many questions. He turned off the radio, where the conversations of colleagues were crackling, and got out of the car. The cold air hit his face, but the adrenaline was already pumping blood. Coming closer, Mark made out a man, about 35 years old, tall, with a short haircut and a calm expression on his face. He noticed Mark when he was already approaching the glass doors of the hotel, and slowed down a little. "Hey, buddy," Mark's voice was sharp, habitually commanding. "Prove that you were here for a reason. State your name, show me your documents." The man stopped. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not show any fear or irritation, only slight surprise. He put his briefcase on the ground and slowly raised his hands, showing empty palms. "My name is Justin Carter," he said in an even, deep voice. "The documents are in my coat pocket. I can get them out if you don't mind." Mark stepped closer, keeping his hand on his holster. He did not like it when people spoke so calmly. It seemed like a challenge to him. Slowly, he ordered. "And no tricks." Justin nodded, carefully unbuttoned his coat, and pulled out a leather wallet. But as he handed it to Mark, he saw Justin's fingers twitch, barely noticeable, but enough for Mark to react. Instinct worked faster than reason. He grabbed Justin's wrist, twisted his arm, and pushed him toward the car. The wallet fell to the pavement, opened, and a gold-embossed card slid out. Mark didn't have time to see it. He was already pressing Justin's face against the hood of the Lexus. "Are you trying to resist?" Mark barked, snapping the handcuffs shut. The metal clicked, echoing down the street. "You're making a huge mistake," Justin replied. His voice was steady, but there was steel in it. He didn't twitch, didn't scream. He just looked away while Mark searched his pockets. "You were the one who made a mistake when you thought you could walk around like a king," Mark said through gritted teeth. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer of the law. You know your rights, right?" Justin said nothing. His breathing was even, but there was something burning in his eyes that Mark couldn't place. Not fear, not anger, but something deeper. People began to gather around him. Someone pulled out a phone, the light from the camera blinding Mark for a second. He heard whispers, the click of shutters, snatches of phrases. "The cops again? Why did they do this to him? Everyone back!" Mark shouted, dragging Justin to the patrol car. "This is not a circus." He pushed Justin into the back seat and slammed the door. His heart was pounding, but it was a familiar feeling: control, order, power. Mark picked up his wallet from the ground and glanced at the card. Justin R. Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He froze for a second, then shook the thought off. A fake, he decided. Too convenient. Justin didn't say a word on the way to the station. Mark kept glancing at the rearview mirror, where he sat upright, looking out the window, as if the whole thing didn't concern him. The silence was irritating. Usually, the people he was arresting either begged or threatened, but this one was stone silent. At the station, everything went according to the standard scenario. Mark filled out paperwork while Justin was led into the interrogation room. The sergeant at the counter, a tired Hispanic named Jorge, nodded lazily at Mark. "Another one?" he asked, still drinking his coffee. "Suspicious guy," Mark muttered. He resisted, lied about the FBI. We'll find out who he is soon enough. Jorge chuckled, but said nothing. Half an hour later, as Mark was finishing his report, a noise burst into the station. The door swung open and two suits walked into the hall, a man and a woman, both cold-faced and wearing badges on their lapels. Behind them was Lieutenant Wilson, Mark's boss, his usually calm face flushed with tension. "Stevens," Wilson barked, barely containing his anger. "To my office. Now." Mark stood up, his stomach clenching. He glanced at the interrogation room. Justin was sitting there, no longer cuffed, talking to one of the suits. His posture was relaxed, but the same fire was still burning in his eyes. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, walking behind Wilson. In the office, the lieutenant collapsed into a chair and pointed a finger at Mark. "Do you know who you brought in?" Wilson's voice was shaking with rage. "It's Justin Carter, a federal agent. A real one. With access to people who can make sure we're all out of work by morning." Mark opened his mouth, but the words stuck. He remembered the card, Justin's cold gaze, his calm. It wasn't fake. It was worse. He fought back, Mark managed. "I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Wilson slammed his fist on the table. "You threw him on the pavement in front of the cameras. Do you have any idea what you got us into?" Mark was silent. Through the glass of the office, he watched Justin being led out. He nodded to the suits, picked up his briefcase, and headed for the exit. For a second, their eyes met through the glass. Justin didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked, and that was enough to make Mark feel like the ground was slipping out from under his feet. As the precinct door closed behind Justin, Wilson exhaled. "I hope you have a good lawyer, Stevens. Because this is just the beginning." Mark walked back to his desk, feeling the silence in the station becoming unbearable. The phone on his desk buzzed, a text from his partner. "You're on the news, bro." And that's not a compliment. He clicked on the link. The video of his arrest had already racked up 50,000 views. The headline read, "Cop Abusing Authority, Another Case of Bias." He watched his face, cold and hard, flash across the screen. And for the first time in 12 years of service, he felt like control was slipping from his hands. The morning after his arrest began with silence, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that presses down like a slab of concrete. Mark woke up in his cramped apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, the smell of stale beer mingling with the dampness of a leaky faucet. His phone was on the nightstand, the screen flashing with notifications. He didn't bother checking. He knew what was there. Colleagues, reporters, strangers who suddenly felt it important to tell him everything they thought. Instead, he stood up, made coffee, and turned on the TV. A mistake. The video was playing on the screen, his face twisted in a grimace of determination, and Justin Carter pinned to the pavement. The anchor's voice was even, but every word hit like a hammer. Mark threw his phone on the couch and stared at the ceiling. The city was noisy outside, and inside him there was a growing feeling that he had just lost not just his job, but himself. Okay, we'll go with option one. The rift in the precinct is growing. Here's the third part of the story, which continues to develop the conflict, deepens Mark's internal tension, and maintains the intrigue. It fits the given style and structure. The days after the suspension dragged on slowly, like frozen asphalt in the heat. Mark spent them in his apartment, where the silence was interrupted only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional call from Tony. He avoided the news, but it found him, through texts, through the looks of his neighbors, through random snippets of conversation in the store. The video of Justin Carter's arrest went viral, exceeding 1 million views, and now everyone in Chicago seemed to know his name. And not in a good way. On the morning of the 5th day, Tony knocked on the door. Mark answered without looking through the peephole. He knew it was him. His partner stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a tired expression. His jacket was wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. "You look like shit," Tony said, handing him the coffee. "Thanks for the compliment." Mark took the cup and walked over to the couch. "What's up?" Tony sat down across from him, rubbing his temples. "The precinct is in chaos. The guys are divided after you got suspended. Some say you're right, that Carter asked for it. This is a tough neighborhood, and you were doing your job. Others." He hesitated. "Others think you set us all up. Jorge almost got into a fight with the new guy, Jackson, yesterday. He called you a racist right in the break room." Mark squeezed the cup. The word racist echoed in his head like a gunshot. He'd heard it in the comments under the video, seen it on the posters outside the precinct, but from a colleague, it was different. Jackson? This kid's been in uniform for 3 months and he's already an expert. Mark's voice shook with anger. "He's black, Mark," Tony said quietly. "This is personal for him. And he's not alone. Half the precinct is now whispering that you're the symbol of everything that's wrong with the police. And the other half is ready to fight for you. Wilson is trying to keep everyone in line, but it's like holding water in your hands. Mark leaned back on the couch, looking at the ceiling. He imagined the precinct, noisy, cramped, smelling of coffee and sweat. For 12 years he'd been part of this machine, knew everyone by name, knew who drank their coffee how, who hid their cigarettes in their desk. And now they were divided into for and against him. "Whose side are you on?" he asked, not looking at Tony. Tony paused. Then he sighed. "I'm with you, brother. But I'm not blind." The video looks shitty. And those complaints the feds were talking about, they didn't just come out of thin air. I just want you to be honest with yourself. Honest. Mark sat up straight. I risked my life for 12 years to keep the streets clean. I didn't pick and choose who I got. White, black, Hispanic. I saw a threat and I responded. That's my job. Maybe so, Tony shrugged. But right now, this job is eating you up. And us, too. They fell silent. The coffee was getting cold in his hands. Then Tony added, "There's a bunch of guys meeting at the bar tonight. The ones who are for you. They want to talk about getting you out. Are you coming?" Mark nodded, though his insides were fighting back. He didn't want to see their faces, didn't want to hear their support or their doubts. The Rusty Anchor was a cramped bar with sticky tables and the smell of cheap beer. Mark walked into nods and the occasional pat on the shoulder. There were familiar faces. Ryan, a big guy with an Irish accent who always wore his cap backwards. Sarah, the only woman on their shift, with a sharp tongue and an even sharper gaze, and a few others. About 10 people in all. They pushed tables together, ordered beers, and talked quietly, like conspirators. "We're with you, Stevens," Ryan began, slamming his mug on the table. "This Carter shit is a witch hunt. The feds wanted to look good, and the media is blowing it out of proportion. You did what any of us would have done." "Exactly," Sarah said. "If we checked our papers before we acted, half the assholes would have run. You did what the situation called for." Mark nodded, warmed by their words. But something inside him was clawing. He remembered the look in Justin's eyes, his calm, his words, "You're making a mistake." And those complaints Agent Kelly mentioned. 3 cases, all against black people. Coincidence? "What if they're right?" he said suddenly, not expecting the words. His voice was quiet, but everyone fell silent. "What if I really did go too far? Not just with Carter, but in general?" Ryan frowned. "Are you siding with them? After everything they've done to you?" "No," Mark shook his head. "I'm just trying to understand why this happened." "Why me?" Sarah leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Because you're a cop, Mark. And cops are a target right now. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, they'll find something to latch on to. But if you start to doubt yourself, they'll win." The conversation continued, but Mark wasn't listening anymore. He was staring into the cloudy glass of his mug, thinking about the names in his notebook. Then someone turned on the TV in the corner of the bar at the news. Justin Carter appeared on the screen, dressed in a suit, behind the podium. His voice was even but firm. "This incident isn't just one man's mistake. It's a symptom of a system that cares more about skin color than facts. I demand a full audit of the Chicago Police Department." The camera showed the crowd in front of the station, already hundreds of people with signs. Someone shouted, "Justice for Carter." Mark felt the beer in his stomach curdle. "Turn that shit off," Ryan muttered, but the bartender just shrugged. As Mark stepped outside, a cold wind hit his face. Tony caught up with him at the car. "Are you okay?" he asked. "No," Mark answered honestly. "I'm not sure I will be." He got behind the wheel and drove home. Justin's words, his colleagues' looks, those 3 complaints were spinning in his head. At home, he took out his chest recorder. He still had a copy of the recordings, despite the suspension. He turned on the video of the arrest. He watched his hands pushing Justin, his voice cutting through the air. For the first time, he saw himself from the outside, not a cop, but an outsider, cold and hard. And he didn't like that face. The phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "Stevens, we need to talk. This is not a threat. This is an opportunity. DK." Mark froze. Justin Carter. He knew that for a fact. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the text from Justin Carter. "This is not a threat. This is an opportunity." The words swirled in his head like a splinter that would not come out. He didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. Instead, he pulled out an old laptop, plugged in a chest recorder, and began copying files. Every arrest for the past 3 years. Every face, every voice. If they wanted a war, he thought, he wasn't going down without a fight. The morning came with a headache and determination. Mark lay awake, reviewing the footage. He searched for evidence, moments where his actions were justified, where the threat was real. But the longer he watched, the more he saw a pattern. Black faces. Black voices. Young men in hoodies, men in expensive cars, women with sharp gestures. He was arresting them more often than he was arresting white people. He didn't want to see it, but the numbers weren't lying. Of the 87 violent arrests over 3 years, 63 were against black people. In a neighborhood where half the residents were African American, that was understandable, but not entirely. He slammed his laptop shut and drove to the Rusty Anchor. Ryan, Sarah, and the others were waiting for him. They looked tired but determined, like soldiers about to go to battle. "We're with you, Stevens," Ryan said as soon as Mark sat down. "This isn't just about you. This is about all of us. If they fire you for doing your job, any one of us could be out on the street tomorrow." "They're using Carter to make a big deal out of it," Sarah added. "Black on white, the same old thing. You just got caught in the crossfire." Mark nodded, but Sarah's words stung. Black on white. He'd heard it his whole life, on the news, at the station, in bars like this. But this wasn't abstract anymore. This was about him and Justin. White cop versus black agent. And he didn't know how to get out of that frame. "I want my badge back," he said quietly. "I have the tapes. I can prove I followed protocol. Not just with Carter, but before. This isn't about color. This is about safety." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "That's our Mark. Get everything you've got and show those feds they're wrong." At home, Mark continued working. He sorted through the tapes, took notes, compared notes. In one video, a guy in a hoodie, black, 19, was yelling at him, waving his arms, and Mark twisted his arm and tackled him to the ground. Traffic threat? Yes. Justification for force? Yes. In another, a man, white, drunk, shoved Mark outside a bar. Mark simply pulled him aside and called for backup. The difference was obvious, and it scared him. By evening, he had a dossier, 20 cases where he had been equally strict, regardless of race. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to show that he wasn't preying on blacks. He was a cop, not a racist. In the morning, he sent a copy to Tony and drove to the station to meet with the union lawyer. But a surprise awaited him at the station. There was a crowd at the entrance, maybe 100 people. Signs read, "No to racism in policing. Justice for Carter." Black faces, angry and tired, looked at him like he was an enemy. Someone shouted, "Hey, Stevens, how can you sleep after what you did?" Mark gritted his teeth and walked inside, feeling the stares burning his back. The lawyer, an older white man named Howard, was waiting in the conference room. He looked over the file, nodded. "Not bad, Mark. We can show that you did not target Carter because of the color of his skin. But there's a problem. The feds found witnesses to old complaints. 3 black men are willing to testify that you used force without cause. And Carter is backing them up. Witnesses." Mark frowned. "These cases are closed. No one went to trial." "Now we get there," Howard sighed. Carter made a noise, and people started talking. "This isn't just about you. This is about how black people see the police. You're the face of a system that's oppressing them. And the system won't protect you." Mark clenched his fists. "I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm not a racist. I'm a cop." Howard shook his head. "Prove it to them." He nodded toward the window, where the crowd was chanting. Because all they see now is a white guy in a uniform who threw a black agent to the pavement. That evening, the news added fuel to the fire. Justin Carter spoke at a press conference. His face was calm, but his eyes were blazing. Officer Stevens is not the only one at fault. He's a product of a system where white cops too often see black people as threats. "I don't just want him fired. I want reform. So my kids don't grow up afraid of a badge." The camera panned to a crowd of black men and women, some with children, cheering. Mark turned off the TV, but Justin's words echoed in his head. He opened his laptop and found an old video of an arrest from 2019. A black guy, 17, had stolen a bottle from a convenience store. Mark had hit him in the legs with a baton as he ran. A threat? No, just anger. He watched the footage and for the first time felt a chill in his chest. His phone buzzed. "Tony, get the file. We're going to Wilson tomorrow. But be prepared, half of these guys are against you now. They say you sold them out for your own skin." Mark put the phone down and stared into the darkness. He wanted to fight. But who? The feds? The crowd? Himself? Black against white. And he was somewhere in the middle, the ground creaking beneath his feet. Okay, let's go with option 3, the climax of the investigation. In this part, I will keep the focus on racism and black versus white as the main theme, bringing the conflict to a climax. Mark will face the system, Justin, and himself at a hearing where racial tensions will come to the fore. Here is part 5. Part 5, the climax. The week before the hearing passed in a strange fog. Mark hardly left the house, only to go to his lawyer and back. Howard prepared him like a boxer before the ring. Speak clearly, don't make excuses, stick to the facts. But the facts felt as shifty as sand underfoot. The dossier he had compiled lay on his desk, a neat folder, 20 cases where he had followed protocol. He told himself that it was his shield. But every time he opened his laptop, he returned to those videos where his nightstick fell faster than it should have, where his voice was louder than it should have been. And almost always, black faces. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning at the City Hall. Mark arrived early, wearing an old suit that was too tight for him. There was already a crowd at the entrance, hundreds of people, mostly black, holding signs that read, white uniforms, black menaces, the system is guilty. Someone spat in his direction as he passed, but Mark didn't turn around. Inside, things were no better. The room was buzzing, reporters were crowding the doors, and agents Kelly and Morgan were sitting in the front row, their faces like stone masks. Justin Carter was the last to enter. His suit was impeccable, his movements calm, but his eyes held the same fire that Mark had seen the night of his arrest. He sat down at the table across from them, next to the FBI representatives, and nodded to the chairwoman of the commission, an elderly woman with a tired look. "Here we go," she said, banging her gavel. "The case of Officer Mark Stevens. Charges, excessive force, possible racial bias. Mr. Carter, you have the floor." Justin stood up. His voice was even, but every word cut like a knife. "On February 17th, I was arrested for no reason. Officer Stevens saw a black man in an expensive car and decided I was a threat. He didn't check my papers, he didn't listen to me, he acted on prejudice. But it's not just me. He's had 3 complaints filed against him in the last 5 years, all by black men. This isn't a fluke. This is a system where white cops see us as enemies, not citizens." The room began to buzz. Someone shouted, "Truth." Mark felt sweat trickle down his back. He looked at Justin, at his confidence, and for the first time thought, what if he's right? Howard nudged him with his elbow. "Your turn," he whispered. Mark stood up, clutching the folder. His voice was shaking, but he forced himself to speak. "I've been a cop for 12 years. I've protected the streets, risked my life. On February 17th, I saw a suspicious situation, an expensive car in a high-crime area. Mr. Carter was reaching for his pocket, I reacted. It wasn't the color of my skin. It was my job. Here's the evidence," he held up the folder, 20 cases where I acted the same, regardless of race. He sat down, feeling his heart pounding. But the room didn't go quiet. A woman in the front row, a black woman in her 40s, stood up and shouted, "What about my son? You broke his arm for a bottle of water in 2019. Is that work too?" Mark recognized her. The mother of the guy from the video. He opened his mouth, but the chairwoman slammed her gavel down. "Silence. Agent Kelly, your findings." Kelly stood up, holding the report. "We reviewed Stevens's records for 5 years. Of the 112 violent arrests, 78 were against black people. That's 70%. The neighborhood is 50% African American. The statistics speak for themselves. We also found witnesses in 3 complaints. Their statements confirm that force was used without an overt threat." Mark clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, that he hadn't looked at skin color, but the numbers were against him. Howard whispered, "Hang in there. We can still fight back." But then Justin stood up. He approached the podium, holding a photo of a boy of about 10, black, smiling. "This is my son," he said. "I work for the FBI, so he can live in a world where he won't be thrown to the ground for being black. Officer Stevens may not have meant to be a racist, but he is part of a system that sees us as a threat. And until that system changes, people like me will pay the price." The room erupted in applause. Mark looked at the photo, at the boy's face, and felt something inside him crumble. He remembered his arrests, his screams, his hands on other people's bodies. Black bodies. Too many times. The committee retired to deliberate. An hour later, the chair returned. "The decision has been made. Officer Stevens, you are dismissed from the Chicago Police Department for repeated violations of protocol and substantiated instances of excessive force. Further action will be considered at a later date." The crowd murmured. Someone shouted, "Victory!" Mark stood up, his legs weak. Howard slapped him on the shoulder, but he didn't feel it. He walked out of the room, past the crowd that looked at him with hatred and triumph. Black faces. He was their enemy, a white cop, a symbol of everything they hated. At home, he collapsed on the couch, looking at the box of things from the station that they gave him on the way out. A badge, a uniform, old certificates. 12 years, And that's it. He turned on the TV. Justin was giving an interview. This is not the end. This is the beginning. We will fight until the police stop dividing us into black and white. Mark turned off the screen. The question was spinning in his head. Was he a racist? He didn't know. But he knew that the system he lived in saw skin color. And he was part of it. An hour later, Tony called. Sorry, brother. Half the guys are happy, the other half are in shock. What's next? I don't know, Mark replied. Maybe it's time to realize what I've done. He hung up and opened his laptop. His face from that video was frozen on the screen, cold, hard, white. And Justin's face was there, black, with eyes full of righteous anger. Mark hadn't left the house for 3 weeks since the hearing. His dismissal had left him empty, without a uniform, without a route, without a purpose. He got up late, made coffee, looked out the window at gray Chicago, and tried to figure out who he was now. The phone was silent. Tony called a couple of times, but Mark didn't pick up. He didn't turn on the news, but snippets of it still reached him. The protests outside the station had died down. Justin Carter had become a hero, and the name Mark Stevens had become synonymous with police brutality. White cop versus black agent. That's what the headline said, and that frame was suffocating him. One morning, Mark ran out of coffee. He pulled on an old jacket and went to the corner store. The cold wind bit his face, but he didn't notice. His thoughts were somewhere else. He picked up a can of Folgers at the counter, paid, and walked out, almost colliding with a man in a dark coat. The man stopped. Mark looked up and froze. Justin Carter was standing in front of him, holding a bag of groceries, as calm as he had been that night outside the hotel. Stevens, Justin said. His voice was even, without anger or mockery. Just a fact. Carter, Mark nodded, clutching the can. He expected anything. Accusation, triumph, a cold look. But Justin just looked at him, and there was something new in that look. Not hatred. Curiosity? I didn't expect to see you here. Justin continued, putting the bag down. This isn't your neighborhood, is it? Not anymore. Mark shrugged. After everything. I live a quiet life. And what are you doing here? I was visiting my sister. Justin nodded towards the neighboring house. She lives here. My son is with her now. Mark remembered the photo with the boy at the hearing. 10 years old, smiling, black eyes. He wanted to say something, but the words got stuck. Instead, he asked, why didn't you resist then? That night. You could have stopped me. Justin smiled slightly, the first time Mark saw it. What's the point? You were on edge. I knew that any movement would make things worse. And not for me, for those who were filming. I wanted them to see the truth. The truth. Mark repeated the word, and it burned his throat. Do you think I took you because of the color of your skin? Justin was silent, looking somewhere past him. I don't know what you thought, but I know what I saw. A black guy in a nice car, and you thought I was out of place. It's not just you, Stevens. It's how we're seen. Every day? Mark wanted to argue, to talk about the neighborhood, about instinct, about the job. But instead he asked, what if I were a black cop? Would you be lying on the pavement too? Justin looked him in the eye. Maybe not. Maybe yes. The difference is, a black cop would probably know what it was like for me to be standing there. You didn't. You didn't want to know. The words hit him like a slap in the face. Mark remembered his arrests, the screams, the faces. Black faces. He didn't want to see it as racism. He called it duty. But now, looking at Justin, he could feel that certainty cracking. I'm not a racist, he said quietly, as if tasting the words. I was a cop. Maybe so, Justin said. But cops aren't just people. They are a mirror. And I didn't like what you reflected. They fell silent. The street had a life of its own. Cars honking, children screaming somewhere in the distance. Mark suddenly realized that this was the first time he had spoken to Justin as a person and not as an enemy. And it was confusing. Why did you write to me? He asked finally. It's a chance. What chance? Justin picked up the bag, thought. A chance to understand. Not for me, for you. I saw your face at the hearing. You weren't just angry. You doubted. And I thought, maybe you're not hopeless. Mark opened his mouth, but Justin raised his hand. Don't answer now. Just think. If you want to talk, you know where to find me. He left, leaving Mark alone with a can of coffee and a buzzing in his head. At home, he sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and found a website for a course on police bias. He'd heard about it from Tony, but he'd laughed at the time. Now he looked at the description, for current and former officers. Learn to understand, not justify. He signed up without thinking. The first class was 3 days later. Mark walked into a small room downtown, feeling like an outsider. The people around him, white, black, Latino, looked at him warily. The teacher, a woman in her 50s, black, began by asking, "Why are you here?" Mark answered honestly, "I don't know who I am now, and I want to understand who I was." She nodded, and the class began. They talked about statistics, about psychology, about how skin color changes everything, even when you don't want it to. Mark listened to the stories. The guy who'd been pulled over 5 times in a month for looking suspicious. The mother whose son had been afraid of the police since he was 6. The cop who quit because he was tired of seeing his uniform scare people. Black voices. Real. During the break, he went outside to smoke. And he saw Justin standing at the entrance, holding a folder. Their eyes met. "I never thought I'd see you here," Justin said, coming closer. "Me too," Mark replied. He exhaled smoke and added, "But I'm tired of not understanding." Justin nodded. "It's the beginning, Stevens. Not the end." They stood in silence, two people on opposite sides of a chasm that had suddenly narrowed a little. Mark knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could get there. A year later, Mark stood in the same room where he'd started the course. The microphone was shaking in his hands, dozens of eyes in front of him, black, white, tired, curious. Justin sat in the third row, arms crossed, a faint shadow of a smile on his face. "I was a cop for 12 years, Mark began, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was upholding the law, but I defended a system that broke more than it saved. I didn't want to see skin color, but I did. And I acted, too often against black people. I was wrong." The room was silent. Mark exhaled. "I can't fix the past, but I can tell you, we need to change. All of us. So that the badge doesn't divide us into us and them. I'm learning, and I advise you to do the same." He fell silent. Justin nodded at him, not as an enemy, but as an equal. The applause was quiet but sincere. Later, the news carried his words. The comments exploded. Anger, support, arguments. Mark looked at the screen and knew this was not the end. This was the beginning. Black and white were still looking at each other across the chasm, but he no longer wanted to be the wall between them.